Well, kind words. This time I yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee on domestic policy, and of course for 5 minutes, and the gentleman from Cleveland who has done a fantastic job, Congressman Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Bernanke. Contrary to the popularly held belief that the government went too far in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch deal, our investigation reveals that what is remarkable is what the government did not do. In 2 meetings in December 2008, Bank of America's Ken Lewis asserted that he had only recently become aware of the deteriorating situation at Merrill Lynch. He asserted that he believed he could justify invoking the Material Adverse Effect Clause, the MAC, to back out of the deal. And he asserted that he needed considerable help from the government, including $13 billion more in new cash, as well as protection from Merrill Lynch's losses. Staff and officials at the Fed looked more closely at the basis for Lewis's assertions and determined, and this is a quote, that they were, quote, somewhat suspect, unquote. The Fed found, in contradiction to Ken Lewis's representations, that Bank of America failed to do adequate due diligence in acquiring Merrill Lynch. The Fed found that Bank of America had known about accelerating losses at Merrill Lynch since mid-November, when shareholders could have used that information to decide on a ratification of the merger. And senior officials at the Fed believed that Bank of America could be in violation of securities laws for failing to inform shareholders about the Merrill Lynch losses known in mid-November. Furthermore, they believed that Ken Lewis's threat of invoking a MAC was a bargaining chip and was not credible, that Bank of America was experiencing its own losses independent of Merrill Lynch and needed to be bailed out itself, and that there were serious doubts about the competence of Bank of America's management. Yet, in spite of the Fed's doubts felt about Ken Lewis's management of Bank of America, the Fed's leadership orchestrated an aid package that attached no meaningful conditions to the money. The Fed required no changes whatsoever in Bank of America's deficient corporate leadership. The Fed even gave Bank of America more money than what Ken Lewis had originally asked for. The disconnection between the Fed's analysis of what went wrong at Bank of America and what the Fed was willing to do about it is significant for all of us and is the subject of today's hearing. If the Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger posed a systemic risk in December 2008, the post-rescue merger entity continues to pose a systemic risk or potential systemic risk in 2009. If bad decisions by corporate management can have systemic consequences, then the Fed's remedy in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch case amplifies the risk posed by poor corporate leadership, because it signals that incompetence practiced by the management of a very large financial institution will be subsidized, not punished, by government regulators. The Fed's decision-making process in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger makes the case for a significant increase in accountability at the Fed. Its regulation of systemic risk needs to be subject to congressional oversight. Its interventions in markets to recover from the current financial crisis need to be audited by the Government Accountability Office, as I've proposed in a bill and in an amendment adopted unanimously by this committee. We can't afford to make the Fed a super regulator, as some have proposed, without also increasing its transparency in meaningful ways, as this committee has proposed through the Kucinich amendment. I want to thank the Chairman for the opportunity to work with you on this hearing, and I look forward to Mr. Bernanke's testimony, and I want to thank you, sir, for being here today. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio. We will now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the Domestic Policy Subcommittee, Congressman Jordan of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a brief statement here. Thank you for holding today's hearing on the government's involvement in the Bank of America's deal to purchase Merrill Lynch. I appreciate Chairman Bernanke's appearance before the committee today. His testimony is important to bring further transparency to the role of the federal government in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch transaction and the overall financial crisis. I'm troubled by the information and documents that the committee's investigation has uncovered. They show that Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Paulson threatened to fire Ken Lewis and his board of directors in order to force the Bank of America to acquire Merrill Lynch. I recognize that these actions took place in a time of significant economic challenges and uncertainty, but there must be limits to government action, even in the time of crisis, and those limits must be respected. We must also keep in mind that this pressure was exerted after many of the nation's banks were forced to accept taxpayer money through the TARP program. We know that in October of 2008, Mr. Paulson, Mr. Bernanke, Mr. Geithner, and Ms. Baer brought the CEOs of the largest private banks in America to the Treasury Department and demanded that they accept the partial nationalization of their banks. I look forward to learning more about Mr. Bernanke's role in this process as well. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I would ask for unanimous consent to include in the record majority and minority reports and all documents referenced in those hearing or reports.
Without objection, so ordered.